"You don't belong in this family." Margaret's voice was ice cold, her words slicing through the tense silence in the living room. I stared at her, frozen. My suitcase sat by the door, packed with what little I could take with me. My dad hovered nearby, silent as always, his eyes fixed on the floor. He wouldn't look at me. Margaret, on the other hand, met my gaze with that same steely indifference she'd always worn around me. "I don't understand," I managed, my voice trembling. "Why are you sending me away?" "It's for the best," she said, her tone clipped. "You'll be happier with your relatives. This arrangement hasn't worked for any of us." She said it so casually, as if uprooting my life was just another item on her to-do list. My name is Louise, and I was 15 when my stepmother decided I didn't belong in her version of a family. My mom had passed away when I was 9, and for a while it was just me and my dad. I missed her terribly, but at least we were close. Then Margaret entered the picture. She wasn't cruel, not outright, but she didn't try to hide her disinterest in me either. She married my dad, brought her daughter Charlotte into the house, and acted as if they were the only ones who mattered. Over time, it became clear that I wasn't part of her plans. She ignored me at family dinners, dismissed my achievements, and constantly found subtle ways to push me aside. My dad never stood up for me. He'd just mumble something about keeping the peace and ask me to try harder to get along. When Margaret finally sent me to live with distant relatives, I stopped expecting him to protect me. Life with my relatives was far from perfect. They weren't unkind, but they weren't particularly warm either. I spent most of my teenage years feeling like a guest in their home, working after school to save for college and relying on books to escape the loneliness. It was through volunteering that I found a sense of purpose. Helping others reminded me that I wasn't powerless. It gave me a direction, a reason to push forward. By the time I turned 25, I'd built something of my own, a nonprofit organization dedicated to empowering people who had been overlooked or cast aside. The work filled me with pride, and for the first time, I felt like I truly belonged somewhere. I hadn't thought about Margaret in years, but life has a way of bringing the past back when you least expect it. Years passed, and the bitterness I felt toward Margaret began to fade, not because I forgave her, but because I had no room in my life for her anymore. I'd built something for myself, something bigger than her dismissal. My nonprofit, Community Horizons, started small, working with underfunded schools and shelters to provide grants and resources. At first, it was just me and a small team of volunteers, scraping together donations and making things happen on sheer willpower. Over time, though, the organization grew. With each successful project, our reputation spread, and so did the support. By the time I was 32, Community Horizons had become one of the most respected nonprofits in the region. We managed scholarships, funded local businesses, and even helped struggling families rebuild their lives. One afternoon, I sat in my office reviewing grant applications. It was my favorite part of the job, reading stories of perseverance and deciding how best to help people who are working hard to improve their lives. My assistant Evelyn walked in with a fresh stack of applications. "Got another batch for you," she said, setting the pile on my desk. "Thanks," I said, grabbing the first folder from the top. The name on the application stopped me cold, Margaret Bennett. For a moment, I just stared at the page. Her name jumped out at me like a bad dream resurfacing after years of dormancy. Slowly, I flipped through the application. She was requesting funding to save a small cafe she'd opened after retiring from her corporate job. I let out a shaky laugh, the absurdity of the situation washing over me. Margaret Bennett, my stepmother, the woman who had cast me aside without a second thought, was asking for help from me. Evelyn noticed my expression. "Everything okay?" she asked. I cleared my throat, slipping the folder back onto the pile. "Yeah, just a familiar name, that's all." "Good familiar or bad familiar?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "Let's just say it's complicated," I replied. Later that evening, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The irony was almost poetic. The woman who had once told me I didn't belong in her family was now turning to my organization for help. Part of me wanted to laugh, but another part of me felt something else. Anger, maybe, or sadness. After all these years, Margaret's actions still lingered in the corners of my mind, reminding me of the rejection I'd worked so hard to overcome. But this wasn't just about the past. Now, I had the power to decide how this story would end. The next morning, I sat at my desk with Margaret's application spread out in front of me. My coffee had gone cold, but I barely noticed. The details of her request painted a picture of desperation. Her cafe was struggling due to rising costs and declining foot traffic. She needed funding to keep the doors open, to pay her employees, and to stay afloat. I could almost hear her voice in my head, justifying the situation. "It's for the greater good," she would have said, as if her struggle erased all the damage she'd done to me. Evelyn knocked on the door and poked her head in. "Hey, we've got that board meeting in 20 minutes. You ready?" I nodded, closing the folder. "Yeah, I'll be there." She hesitated. "You sure you're okay? You've been quiet today." I forced a small smile. "I'm fine, just a lot on my mind." As she left, I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. What was I supposed to do? Reject her application out of spite? Approve it and pretend the past didn't matter? Both options felt wrong. Later that day, I called my mentor, Claire. She'd been there for me since the early days of Community Horizons, guiding me through tough decisions and offering wisdom when I needed it most. "What's on your mind?" she asked as soon as she answered. I explained the situation, trying to keep my emotions in check. "Part of me wants to throw the application in the trash," I admitted. "But another part of me feels like, I don't know, like this is some kind of test." Claire was quiet for a moment. "Do you think she knows it's your organization?" "No," I said firmly. "She wouldn't have applied if she did." "Then the question isn't about her," Claire said. "It's about you. What kind of person do you want to be in this moment?" Her words hit me hard. "I want to do what's right," I said, though my voice wavered. "Then take your time," she replied. "You don't have to decide today." That evening, I opened Margaret's file again, this time with a calmer mind. Her cafe might not have been my concern, but her employees were. They didn't deserve to lose their jobs because of her poor management. I realized I wasn't just deciding Margaret's fate. I was deciding what kind of leader I wanted to be. As I closed the file, I made a promise to myself. Whatever I chose, it would be a decision I could live with. The next morning, I began researching Margaret's situation in greater detail. I wanted to understand exactly what I was dealing with before making any decisions. Using the public records of her business, I pieced together a clearer picture of the cafe's struggles. It wasn't hard to see where things had gone wrong. She'd overextended herself, taking out loans to expand without properly budgeting for rising costs. Her menu was outdated, her marketing non-existent, and customer reviews painted a picture of inconsistent service. I sighed, closing my laptop. It was classic Margaret, proud, impulsive, and too stubborn to ask for help until it was almost too late. Later that afternoon, Evelyn caught me staring at the application again. "You know," she said, pulling up a chair, "if this is weighing on you so much, maybe you need to look at it differently." I raised an eyebrow. "How do you mean?" "Well," she began, leaning forward, "why not separate the personal from the professional? Forget who she is for a moment. If this was just another application, what would you do?" Her words gave me pause. It was a good question, and one I didn't have an easy answer for. "I'd probably approve partial funding," I admitted after a moment. "The cafe has potential if it's managed properly, but knowing who she is changes everything." Evelyn nodded. "Of course it does. But you're not just deciding her fate. You're setting an example. For yourself, for this organization, and for everyone who's ever looked up to you." Her words echoed what Claire had said the day before. It wasn't just about Margaret. It was about me, about the principles I'd built my life and career on. That evening, I sat down with the application one last time. I wasn't ready to decide, but I felt closer to understanding what needed to be done. I started drafting a proposal, not for full funding, but for a conditional grant. If Margaret wanted the money, she'd have to meet certain requirements: updated marketing plans, operational improvements, and mandatory workshops for her and her staff. It wasn't just about giving her money, it was about giving her a chance to prove she could change. By the time I finished, the knot in my stomach had loosened. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was one I could live with. The next step would be the hardest: delivering my decision to Margaret herself. The day came for me to finalize my decision. As I sat in my office reviewing the proposal I'd drafted, my emotions were a tangled mess of anger, pity, and a quiet determination to stay true to my values. Evelyn knocked softly on the door and stepped in. "You've been staring at that file for hours," she said, sitting across from me. "Are you ready?" "I think so," I replied, "but the hard part's still ahead." She tilted her head. "You're going to tell her in person, aren't you?" I nodded. "It's the only way. She deserves to hear it directly from me." Evelyn hesitated, then placed a hand on my desk. "You don't owe her this, you know. After everything she did to you, no one would blame you for sending an email and washing your hands of it." "I know," I said softly, "but this isn't about her. It's about me." 2 days later, I stood in the lobby of Margaret's cafe. It was a modest space with scuffed floors and a menu board that hadn't been updated in years. The hum of conversation filled the room, but there was a heaviness in the air, a quiet acknowledgement that this place was struggling to stay afloat. Margaret appeared from the back, her eyes widening when she saw me. "Louise," she said, her voice tinged with both surprise and unease. "Hi, Margaret," I said evenly. She wiped her hands on her apron, glancing around the room as if searching for an escape route. What are you doing here?" I held up the folder containing her application. "We need to talk." Her face paled as realization dawned. "You're the one reviewing my grant?" "I am," I confirmed, my tone calm but firm. "Let's find somewhere private to talk." We sat down in a small, cramped office at the back of the cafe. Margaret's hands fidgeted in her lap as I opened the folder. "I've reviewed your application," I began, keeping my tone professional. "And I have some thoughts." Her eyes darted to mine. "I didn't know," she started, but I raised a hand to stop her. "This isn't about what you knew or didn't know," I said. "It's about the state of your business and whether or not I believe this grant can make a difference." She swallowed hard, nodding silently. I laid out my conditions: partial funding contingent on her participation in workshops, implementing a marketing plan, and providing regular updates on her progress. "If you agree to these terms, we'll approve the grant," I concluded. Margaret's lips trembled as she nodded again, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you." Her gratitude sounded genuine, but I couldn't shake the feeling of lingering tension between us. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of a much-needed reckoning. The silence in the office hung heavy after I laid out the terms of the grant. Margaret sat across from me, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. For someone who had always exuded confidence, seeing her like this felt almost surreal. "I appreciate this," she said finally, her voice uneven. I know I don't deserve it." Her words caught me off guard. Margaret wasn't someone who admitted fault easily, and hearing her say it now stirred something in me. Anger, pity, and a faint flicker of something I couldn't yet name. "This isn't about what you deserve," I replied, keeping my tone steady. "It's about the people who depend on you. Your employees, your customers. They deserve a chance." She nodded, her eyes dropping to her hands. "I didn't know it was you," she said softly. "If I had, I wouldn't have applied." "That's exactly why you need to hear this," I said, leaning forward. "You cast me aside, Margaret. You made me feel like I didn't matter, like I wasn't part of the family. And now you're sitting here asking for help. Do you see the irony in that?" She flinched, her shoulders sinking. "I was wrong," she murmured, barely audible. I wanted to feel vindicated, to bask in the satisfaction of hearing those words. But instead, I felt an ache in my chest, a reminder of the years I'd spent carrying the weight of her rejection. "Why did you do it?" I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop myself. Margaret looked up, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I don't know," she admitted. "When your mother died, I thought I could handle it. But I wasn't ready for you. I was scared, and I took the easy way out." Her voice cracked, and she looked away. "It doesn't excuse what I did. I know that. I don't know how to make it right." For a moment, I just stared at her, my emotions a swirling mix of anger, sorrow, and something resembling closure. Margaret wasn't the invincible figure I'd built up in my mind. She was flawed, broken, and human. "You can start," I said finally, "by taking responsibility for your actions. Not just with me, but with everyone you've let down." She nodded slowly, her expression somber. "I'll do better," she whispered. I didn't know if I believed her, but in that moment, it didn't matter. This wasn't about her redemption. It was about me finding the strength to move forward. As I stood to leave, she reached out hesitantly. "Thank you, Louise. For everything." I paused, meeting her gaze. "Don't thank me, Margaret. Thank the people who gave you this chance." And with that, I walked out of the cafe, feeling lighter than I had in years. Walking out of that cafe, I felt a strange mix of emotions. I'd stood up to Margaret, laid bare the pain she'd caused, and taken the first steps toward letting go of the resentment I'd carried for years. But as much as I wanted to believe this was the end of it, I knew better. Confrontations like that rarely tied everything up in a neat little bow. Back at my office, I dove into the work of approving the grant. The funding wasn't just for Margaret. It was for her employees, her customers, and the community her cafe served. Evelyn and I worked late into the night, finalizing the paperwork and setting the terms that Margaret had reluctantly agreed to. "Do you think she'll follow through?" Evelyn asked as we reviewed the final documents. "She'll have to," I replied. "If she doesn't, the funding gets pulled. This isn't a handout, it's a lifeline, and it comes with strings attached." Evelyn nodded, but her brow furrowed. "And what about you? Do you feel okay about all this?" I leaned back in my chair, letting out a long breath. "I think so. It's complicated, but at the end of the day, this is bigger than her or me. I have to believe that doing the right thing will pay off in the long run." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Margaret started attending the mandatory workshops we'd arranged, though she remained reserved and distant during most of them. I could tell she was uncomfortable, out of her element, but she showed up and did the work. Richard, one of the trainers we'd hired for the workshops, gave me regular updates. "She's making progress," he said during one of our check-ins. "Slowly, but it's there. She's starting to listen, at least." "That's something," I replied, though I couldn't help but wonder if it would last. One afternoon, I received an email from Margaret. It was short, almost awkward, but it caught me off guard. "Louise, I wanted to thank you for giving me this opportunity. I know I don't deserve it, but I'm trying. I hope one day I can prove that to you." I stared at the screen, rereading the words until they blurred. It wasn't much, but it was more than I'd ever expected from her. "Progress," Evelyn said when I showed her the email. "Maybe," I replied, though I wasn't ready to call it that just yet. As the cafe began to stabilize, I saw the impact of the grant taking shape. Foot traffic increased, new marketing strategies brought in fresh customers, and the employees seemed more energized. Margaret was no longer the picture of pride and control that I'd grown up knowing. She was humbled, and though I didn't trust her entirely, I could see her trying. For the first time, I allowed myself to feel a small measure of hope. Maybe this wasn't just a second chance for her. It was one for me, too. The cafe's transformation was gradual, but undeniable. The new marketing strategies brought in a steady stream of customers, and the workshops had helped Margaret and her staff find their footing. The cafe began to hum with a quiet energy that I hadn't seen when I first stepped through its doors. Richard called me one afternoon with an update. "Margaret's really taking to the workshops," he said. "She's even started mentoring some of her younger staff. It's like she's finally realizing what it means to lead by example." "Wow," I replied, surprised. "That's unexpected." "She still has her moments," he added with a chuckle. "But don't we all?" I laughed, but the truth was, I didn't know what to make of it. Margaret had spent so many years being dismissive and self-centered that it was hard to believe she was capable of real change. But I couldn't deny the progress she was making, both in the cafe and apparently in herself. A few weeks later, I decided to visit the cafe unannounced. The place was buzzing with activity when I arrived. Customers chatted at tables, employees worked efficiently behind the counter, and the smell of freshly baked bread filled the air. Margaret was at the register, chatting warmly with a customer. It was a sight I never thought I'd see, her smile genuine, her posture relaxed. She noticed me standing near the door and waved me over. "Louise," she said, her tone surprisingly warm, "I wasn't expecting you." "Thought I'd drop by and see how things were going," I replied, glancing around the bustling cafe. "Looks like business is good." "It is," she said, pride flickering in her eyes. "Thanks to you." Her words caught me off guard. "It's not just me," I said. "You did the work. You earned this." Margaret hesitated, then nodded. "Still, I wouldn't have gotten here without your help." We sat down at one of the tables, and for the first time our conversation felt almost normal. She talked about the challenges of running the cafe, the lessons she'd learned in the workshops, and her plans for the future. "I didn't think I'd enjoy mentoring," she admitted, "but it's been rewarding. The younger staff, they remind me of myself when I first started out. It feels good to help them find their way." Hearing her say that stirred something in me. Maybe people could change if given the chance. As I left the cafe that day, I felt lighter. Margaret's journey wasn't over, and neither was mine. But for the first time, it felt like we were moving in the right direction, separately, but with a newfound respect for each other's paths. Helping her wasn't about redemption or repairing the past. It was about staying true to myself and the values that had shaped me. And in doing so, I'd found a sense of peace I never thought possible. In the weeks following my visit to the cafe, I found myself reflecting on the unexpected turn of events. Margaret's progress was undeniable, and while I wasn't ready to rewrite our history, I couldn't ignore the changes I'd seen in her. One afternoon, I sat at my desk, reviewing a new batch of grant applications. It felt good to return to the work that had always grounded me, but Margaret's file lingered in the back of my mind like an unfinished chapter. Evelyn walked in with her usual pep, placing a cup of tea on my desk. "You've been quiet lately," she said, leaning against the doorframe. "Still thinking about Margaret?" I nodded, wrapping my hands around the warm mug. It's strange. For so long, I told myself I didn't care about her or what she thought of me. But now, I don't know. Seeing her change, it's harder than I expected. "Harder how?" Evelyn asked, her tone curious. "Because it means I can't hold on to the anger anymore," I admitted. "She's not the same person who sent me away, and that scares me, in a way." Evelyn smiled gently. "Letting go of anger isn't weakness, Louise, it's strength. It means you're moving forward, even if she's still catching up." Her words resonated more than I expected. Maybe Evelyn was right. Maybe it was time to let go, not to forgive entirely, but to release the weight of the resentment I'd carried for so long. That evening, I sat by my window, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. I thought about everything that had led me here, the rejection, the struggle, the choices I'd made to build a life that felt meaningful. I didn't need Margaret's approval or validation. I'd proven to myself that I was capable, that I could thrive despite her doubts. But I also realized that holding on to the past would only hold me back. With a deep breath, I made a decision. I would continue supporting the cafe as long as Margaret kept up her efforts. Not for her, but for the people who relied on it, and for me, to honor the person I'd become. This wasn't about fixing the past. It was about moving forward, with or without her. A month later, I received an email update from Richard about Margaret's cafe. The subject line read, "Milestone reached." Curious, I opened it to find a detailed report on their recent successes. Sales had tripled since the implementation of new strategies. Employee retention had improved, and customer reviews were glowing. Attached to the email was a photo of Margaret standing behind the counter, smiling as she handed a customer a pastry. For the first time, she looked genuinely happy, not just proud or determined, but content. I stared at the image for a long time, feeling a mix of emotions I couldn't quite name. This was what I'd hoped for when I approved the grant. Not just financial recovery, but personal growth. Margaret had found a way to adapt, to lead, to build something meaningful again. But most importantly, I realized I had found a way to let go. That evening, Evelyn and I went out for dinner to celebrate Community Horizons' recent achievements. Over a plate of steaming pasta, she leaned across the table and said, "So, what's next for you?" I raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "I mean, you've built this incredible nonprofit. You've faced down the ghosts of your past, and you've come out stronger for it. What's the next big thing on your horizon?" I smiled, considering her question. "Honestly, I think I just want to keep doing what we're doing, helping people, making a difference. But maybe..." I trailed off, an idea forming in the back of my mind. "Maybe what?" She pressed, her eyes lighting up. "Maybe it's time to expand," I said slowly. "Not just grants, but mentorship programs, workshops for people like Margaret, business owners who need guidance and support to adapt." Evelyn grinned. Now that's the Louise I know, always thinking ahead. As I walked home that night, I felt a sense of clarity I hadn't felt in years. The work I'd done with Community Horizons had always been about more than just grants or numbers. It was about giving people a chance to grow, to change, to become better versions of themselves. Margaret's journey had shown me that growth was possible even in the most unlikely circumstances. And while I still didn't fully trust her, I could acknowledge her progress without carrying the weight of the past. I didn't need closure from her. I'd found it in myself. The next morning, I sent Richard a reply to his email. "Great work," I wrote. "Let's keep the momentum going." It wasn't flashy or dramatic, but it was enough. For the first time, I felt free. Free to move forward, to dream bigger, and to let the past be just that, the past.